I need to break the rules. Everyone kept telling me there was another way. I started working at Patterson's distribution center the summer before junior year because my family needed the money more than I needed free time. My dad had been laid off from the auto plant 6 months earlier, and my mom's hours at the nursing home barely covered rent and utilities. My younger brother needed new glasses he couldn't see without, and my sister's asthma medication cost more than our grocery budget most weeks. The job posting said they needed evening warehouse staff for order fulfillment, and the pay was decent enough that I could actually help instead of just watching my parents stress about bills they couldn't pay. The training was only 3 days and mostly consisted of learning how to scan items efficiently and memorize where different product categories lived in the massive warehouse space. The building was cold and loud with forklifts beeping and conveyor belts rattling, and the fluorescent lights made everything look washed out and tired. My supervisor was this guy named Derek, who seemed annoyed that he had to train another high school kid instead of someone who might actually stay longer than a few months. He walked me through the scanning system twice, then handed me a laminated sheet of policies to read and sign. The policy sheet had standard stuff about safety equipment and break schedules and clocking in on time. But the section that Derek specifically pointed to with his pen was highlighted in yellow and said that personal cell phones must remain in lockers during all shift hours with absolutely no exceptions. He explained that they'd had problems with employees texting instead of working, and with people taking unauthorized breaks to make calls. The policy was zero tolerance, which meant your first violation resulted in immediate termination without warning or second chances. He said this part slowly while looking directly at me like he expected me to argue about it. I asked what happened if there was a family emergency and someone needed to reach me. Derek shrugged and said that's what the main office phone number was for, and that family members could call the front desk and leave a message that would be relayed during my scheduled break. I pointed out that my break was only 15 minutes and happened 4 hours into my shift. He said that's how it worked at every warehouse and distribution center he'd ever worked at, and that if I wanted the job, I needed to accept the terms. The paper sat there between us waiting for my signature. My mom had already started talking about which bills we could skip paying this month to afford my brother's glasses. My sister had been rationing her inhaler because we couldn't afford a refill yet. I picked up the pen and signed my name at the bottom of the policy sheet. Derek filed it away in a folder and told me to start the following Monday at 4 o'clock sharp. The first few weeks weren't terrible once I got used to the constant noise and the repetitive motion of scanning items and placing them in bins. My coworkers were mostly older adults who treated the job like a necessary evil that paid slightly better than other options in our area. Nobody talked much during shifts because the warehouse was too loud for casual conversation, and everyone just wanted to finish their orders and go home. I fell into the rhythm of showing up, clocking in, locking my phone in the small metal locker, scanning items for 5 hours, taking one break to eat a granola bar, scanning more items, and clocking out. My routine at home was basically wake up, go to school, come home and help my sister with homework, grab something to eat, drive to the warehouse, work until 9:30, get home around 10, do my own homework until midnight, sleep 6 hours, repeat. My dad spent his days applying for jobs online, and my mom worked doubles whenever she could get them. My sister Emma was 11 and mostly took care of herself after school, but sometimes her asthma flared up and she'd need someone to sit with her while she used her nebulizer. My brother Peter was 14 and dealt with everything by pretending nothing bothered him, even though I knew he was getting bullied at school for wearing glasses with frames that were 2 years out of style. The money from my paychecks got deposited every other Friday, and I'd transfer most of it to my parents' account immediately. We'd managed to get Peter new glasses after my second paycheck and restocked Emma's medication after my third. My mom cried when I showed her the transfer confirmation and said I shouldn't have to do this at 16. I told her it was fine and that lots of kids worked after school. She said most kids use that money for themselves and I should be saving for college. I didn't mention that I'd already accepted I probably wasn't going to college because we couldn't afford it anyway. Around October, I started noticing that Emma was having trouble breathing more often. She'd use her inhaler twice before school and then need it again right when I got home. My mom said she'd make an appointment with the asthma doctor, but we'd need to wait until she got paid to afford the copay. The appointment got scheduled for early November and then pushed back to late November because the doctor's office was booked solid. Emma kept saying she was fine, but I could hear her wheezing from across the room when she thought nobody was listening. The week before Thanksgiving, my supervisor Derek called a meeting during our break to remind everyone that the holiday shopping season meant longer shifts and stricter enforcement of all policies. He said they'd be doing random locker checks to verify that phones were actually staying locked up during work hours. Anyone caught with their phone during a shift would be terminated immediately regardless of their reason or employment history. He looked around the room while he said this part, like he was daring someone to challenge him. Nobody did because everyone there needed their job more than they needed to prove a point. I'd gotten into the habit of checking my phone obsessively before locking it away each shift. I'd scroll through my texts and missed calls and make sure nothing urgent had happened between when I left home and when I arrived at work. My mom had the office number memorized, but I'd never actually received a message through it during any of my breaks. The system seemed designed to make communication as difficult as possible. The first week of December, my dad got called in for a job interview at a factory 2 towns over. The position didn't pay as much as his old job, but it was full-time with benefits, and he was desperate enough to take anything. My mom picked up extra shifts to cover bills while he was busy with the interview process. Emma's doctor appointment got pushed back again because the office had a scheduling conflict. I started working 6 days a week to make up for my mom missing hours at home with Emma. On a Tuesday evening in mid-December, I was 4 hours into my shift when one of the guys from shipping came through our section looking stressed. He asked if anyone had seen his supervisor because there was an urgent call holding at the front desk for someone in our department. Derek was in the bathroom, and everybody else shrugged because it wasn't their problem. The shipping guy left muttering about how nobody could ever find anyone in this building when something actually mattered. I finished scanning a batch of kitchen supplies and moved on to electronics. My hands were starting to hurt from the repetitive motion, and my feet ached from standing on concrete all evening. 30 more minutes until my break, and I could sit down for 15 minutes and check if my family needed anything. The warehouse felt colder than usual, and I regretted not bringing a heavier sweatshirt. Derek came back from the bathroom and immediately got pulled aside by another supervisor who whispered something to him while gesturing toward the front offices. Derek's expression didn't change much, but he nodded a few times and said something I couldn't hear over the conveyor belts. They both walked off together, leaving our section unsupervised, which almost never happened during peak season. I kept scanning items and trying to meet my quota for the hour. The company tracked productivity metrics for every employee, and falling behind meant potentially losing your shift assignment to someone more efficient. Most of my coworkers were doing the same thing, just focusing on their own orders and ignoring whatever drama was happening elsewhere in the building. That's how you survived at places like this. Keep your head down, meet your numbers, don't get involved in other people's problems. 20 minutes before my scheduled break, I noticed Derek walking back through our section with a weird look on his face. He wasn't checking anyone's work or monitoring the line like he usually did. He just walked through and disappeared toward the loading docks. Something about his expression made my stomach feel heavy, but I couldn't figure out why. Nothing had directly happened to me, and worrying about things I couldn't control wouldn't help anyone. My break finally came, and I clocked out for my 15 minutes. The break room was mostly empty, except for a couple of night shift workers who were just starting their evening. I bought a bag of chips from the vending machine and checked the bulletin board out of habit, even though nothing ever changed on it, except occasionally someone would post a used car for sale or apartment listing. The office phone number was printed at the top of every company memo in small text that most people probably never noticed. I finished my chips and spent the last 8 minutes of my break sitting in one of the plastic chairs trying to rest my feet. My phone was locked in my locker 4 hallways away, and I thought about how nice it would be to just quickly check if everything was okay at home. But the policy was clear, and I'd already seen 2 people get fired for phone violations since I'd started working here. Their lockers had been searched during random checks, and they'd been escorted out by security within minutes of the discovery. No explanations, no second chances, just immediate termination. I clocked back in and returned to my station where a new batch of orders had been queued up on my scanner. The next 3 hours passed slowly with the usual warehouse sounds and the usual aching tiredness that came from repetitive physical work. Some nights I could zone out and let my body go through the motions while my mind wandered to other things. Tonight I couldn't seem to settle into that rhythm and kept losing count of how many items I'd scanned. Around 8:30, the overhead speakers crackled to life with an announcement asking for me to report to the front office immediately. My co-workers looked at me with expressions that were hard to read. Getting called to the office during your shift was never a good sign, and usually meant either you'd made a serious error or something worse was about to happen. I set down my scanner and walked toward the front of the building with my heart beating too fast. The office area was quieter than the warehouse floor and had carpet instead of concrete and actual walls instead of open space. The receptionist at the front desk looked uncomfortable when she saw me and gestured toward a small waiting area with 3 chairs. She said someone would be with me shortly. I sat down in the chair closest to the door and tried to figure out what I could have possibly done wrong. My productivity metrics had been fine, and I hadn't missed any shifts or shown up late. Derek appeared from one of the back offices with a woman I'd never seen before who was wearing business clothes that looked out of place in a warehouse setting. They both looked serious in a way that made my stomach drop. Derek said my name and asked me to follow them into a small conference room. The room had a table and 4 chairs and nothing else. The woman introduced herself as someone from Human Resources and said she needed to speak with me about a situation. She explained that the company had received an emergency call on the main line approximately 3 hours ago. The caller had identified herself as my mother and said she needed to speak with me immediately regarding a family emergency. The HR woman said that per company policy, emergency messages were relayed to employees during their scheduled breaks. However, in this case, the nature of the emergency was time-sensitive, and they had attempted to locate me earlier in the evening. I asked what the emergency was and why they waited 3 hours to tell me. Derek looked at the HR woman, who looked at some notes on the table. She said my mother had called to inform me that my younger sister had been taken to the hospital by ambulance. The situation involved respiratory distress, and they were asking me to come to the emergency room as soon as possible. She gave me the name of the hospital, which was the same one where my mom worked. My legs felt like they weren't connected to my body anymore. I asked if my sister was okay, and the HR woman said she didn't have additional details beyond what had been relayed in the initial call. I stood up and said I needed to leave immediately. Derek held up his hand and said we needed to discuss the situation first. I repeated that I needed to leave and reached for the door handle. The HR woman said that she understood this was a difficult situation, but that leaving mid-shift without proper authorization would be considered job abandonment. I turned around and stared at both of them. Derek said that if I left right now without completing the proper exit process, I would be terminated. The HR woman added that she was required to inform me of the consequences before I made my decision. I asked what the proper exit process was, and Derek explained that I needed to fill out an emergency leave request form that would be reviewed by management. If approved, I would be allowed to leave without penalty, but the approval process typically took 24 to 48 hours. I said my sister was in the emergency room right now, and he said he understood that, but policy was policy. The HR woman said that alternatively I could finish my shift, which ended in approximately 45 minutes, and then leave as normal. I told them I wasn't waiting 45 minutes when my sister might be dying. Derek said using dramatic language wouldn't change the situation, and that plenty of people had family emergencies without needing to abandon their shifts. I asked if he was seriously telling me that I couldn't leave to check on my sister in the hospital. He said that's not what he was saying, and that I could make whatever choice I wanted, but that there would be consequences to that choice. The HR woman tried to speak in a calmer tone and said that from the company's perspective, they needed employees to be reliable, and that creating exceptions to shift abandonment policies would be unfair to other workers. She said my family could update me on the situation via the office phone, and that I could go to the hospital as soon as my shift officially ended. I pointed out that they'd waited 3 hours to even tell me about the call. She said that was because I'd been in the middle of my shift, and they'd attempted to relay the message during my break as per standard protocol. I felt something shift in my chest, like a door closing on one future and opening on another one I didn't want. I said I was leaving and walked out of the conference room. Derek followed me into the hallway, saying that if I left the building, I would be terminated immediately, and that I should think very carefully about this decision. I kept walking toward the employee entrance where the lockers were kept. He said I was making a huge mistake, and that jobs like this didn't grow on trees. I opened my locker and grabbed my phone and my jacket. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped my keys twice. There were 17 missed calls from my mom and 6 from my dad, and multiple text messages that I couldn't focus enough to read properly. Derek was standing a few feet away with his arms crossed, saying that this was my last chance to reconsider. I told him I was reconsidering trusting anyone who made me wait 3 hours to find out my sister was in the hospital. The HR woman appeared and said she needed me to sign a termination acknowledgement form. I said I wasn't signing anything and walked toward the exit. She said that refusing to sign didn't change anything, and that my employment was still terminated effective immediately. Derek added that I wouldn't be receiving my final paycheck because I'd left without completing proper exit procedures. I stopped and turned around and asked if he was serious. He said that according to Section 7 of the Employee Handbook, job abandonment constituted forfeiture of any unpaid wages. I walked out into the parking lot where my car was parked under one of the dim streetlights. My phone kept buzzing with new texts and calls. I sat in the driver's seat and tried to read the messages, but my vision was blurry and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Finally, I just called my mom back, and she answered on the first ring. Her voice was hoarse like she'd been crying, and she asked where I'd been for the past 3 hours. I said I'd been at work, and that they only just told me about her call. She said Emma had stopped breathing at home, and that the ambulance had taken her to the emergency room, and that they'd been trying to reach me since 6 o'clock. I asked if Emma was okay now, and she said they'd stabilized her, but that the doctors were running tests to figure out what caused the attack. I told her I was driving to the hospital right now, and she said to be careful. I asked if Dad was there with her, and she said he'd been there, but had to leave to pick up Peter from his friend's house because nobody else could get him. I promised I'd be there in 20 minutes and hung up before she could hear my voice crack. The drive to the hospital felt longer than it should have. Every red light made me want to scream. I kept replaying the conversation with Derek and the HR woman and wondering if there was something I could have said differently that would have made them understand. But I knew that wasn't how it worked at places like Patterson's. Policies existed to protect the company, not the employees. The emergency room waiting area was crowded with people sitting in uncomfortable chairs under fluorescent lights. I found my mom standing near the nurse's station looking exhausted in her work scrubs. She hugged me hard, and I could feel her shoulders shaking. She said Emma was sleeping now, but that she'd been terrified when she couldn't breathe. The doctors had given her oxygen and medication and wanted to keep her overnight for observation. I asked what had caused the attack, and my mom explained that Emma had been doing homework when she started coughing and couldn't stop. She'd used her inhaler multiple times, but nothing helped, and she'd started turning blue around her lips. My mom had called 911 while trying to keep Emma calm. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes and got her breathing stabilized before transporting her to the hospital. My mom said the doctors were concerned that Emma's asthma was progressing and that she might need different medication or possibly a specialist consultation. I didn't ask how much that would cost because I already knew we couldn't afford it. My mom seemed to read my mind and said we'd figure it out somehow. She asked why it took me so long to get there, and I explained what happened at Patterson's. Her face went pale when I told her about the policy and the 3-hour delay and Derek threatening my job if I left. She said they couldn't do that, and I said they already did. She asked about my final paycheck, and I explained what they'd said about job abandonment. She put her hand over her mouth and looked like she might cry again. I told her not to worry about it and that I'd find another job. But we both knew it wasn't that simple. I'd been making decent money at Patterson's, and most other jobs available to high school students paid minimum wage with unpredictable hours. The money I'd been contributing had been covering Emma's medications and helping with groceries and utilities. Losing that income meant my parents would have to make choices again about which bills to pay and which ones to skip. A nurse came out and said we could go back to see Emma for a few minutes. She was sleeping in a bed with an oxygen tube under her nose and monitors beeping softly beside her. She looked so small under the white hospital blankets. My mom sat in the chair next to the bed and held Emma's hand carefully, like she might break. I stood at the foot of the bed feeling useless and angry and scared all at once. The nurse explained that Emma would need to stay overnight and possibly longer depending on test results. My mom asked about costs, and the nurse said someone from billing would speak with us tomorrow. She left us alone with Emma, and I sat down in the other chair and put my head in my hands. My mom said everything would be okay, but her voice didn't sound convinced. We stayed there until visiting hours ended, and a different nurse told us we needed to leave for the night. My mom argued that she wanted to stay with Emma, but they said only parents of very young children were allowed to stay overnight. Emma was 11 and didn't qualify. My mom reluctantly agreed to go home and come back first thing in the morning. I drove her to the house since she'd ridden in the ambulance with Emma. Dad was waiting up when we got home, even though it was after midnight. Peter was already asleep in his room. Dad asked how Emma was, and Mom explained about the oxygen and the overnight observation and the probable need for specialist care. He looked tired in a way that went beyond just needing sleep. He asked what happened with my job, and I gave him the short version about the policy and the choice I'd had to make. He said we'd figure something out, but I could tell he was already calculating numbers in his head and coming up with answers he didn't like. I went to my room and tried to do homework, but couldn't focus on anything. My phone sat on my desk reminding me that if I'd been allowed to have it at work, I would have known 3 hours earlier that Emma was in the hospital. The policy had been designed to prevent employees from wasting time on their phones, but what it actually did was prevent us from being reachable when our families needed us. I stayed up most of that night looking at job listings online. Everything paid less than Patterson's or required availability I couldn't guarantee because of school. Some listings specifically stated they wouldn't hire high school students. Others wanted experience I didn't have. I applied to 12 different places anyway and hoped something would work out. The next morning, I skipped school to go back to the hospital with my mom. Emma was awake and eating Jell-O and seemed more like herself. The doctor came in and explained that her asthma was more severe than they'd initially thought and that she needed to see a pulmonologist for proper treatment planning. They were prescribing a new inhaler and a nebulizer machine for home use. My mom asked about costs, and the doctor said someone from billing would discuss payment options with us. The billing person turned out to be a woman with a sympathetic expression who went through a list of charges that made my stomach hurt. The overnight stay, the emergency treatment, the tests, the new medications, the nebulizer machine rental. Even with my mom's insurance through her job, our portion was more than we had in our bank account. The woman said we could set up a payment plan, but that we'd need to make the first payment within 30 days. Emma got discharged that afternoon with instructions to follow up with the specialist within 2 weeks. We drove home in silence because there wasn't much to say. The medical bills were going to happen whether we could afford them or not. My job was gone whether it was fair or not. Emma needed specialized care whether we could pay for it or not. I spent the next week applying for more jobs and hearing nothing back. I tried calling Patterson's HR department to ask about my final paycheck and got transferred 3 times before someone told me that my file showed job abandonment and no final pay was owed. I asked to speak to someone higher up and was told that the decision was final and that further calls would not change the outcome. My mom called her union representative to ask if there was anything they could do about a workplace that wouldn't let employees leave for family emergencies. The rep said that policies about shift abandonment were generally legal as long as they were applied consistently, and that proving discrimination would be difficult. She said we could file a complaint with the labor board, but that those cases took months or years to resolve. I talked to my guidance counselor at school about what happened, and she seemed genuinely upset on my behalf. She said it sounded unreasonable, but that she wasn't sure what could be done about it. She suggested I focus on finding new employment and maintaining my grades so I'd have options after graduation. I didn't tell her that college wasn't really an option anymore because that conversation felt pointless. Peter asked me one night why I wasn't working anymore, and I explained about the phone policy and Emma's emergency. He said that seemed stupid and unfair. I agreed but said that stupid and unfair was pretty standard for most jobs. He asked if I was going to sue them or something, and I said we couldn't afford a lawyer. He went quiet after that. Emma's pulmonologist appointment happened 2 weeks later, and the specialist confirmed that her asthma was severe and potentially life-threatening if not properly managed. She needed daily controller medications in addition to her rescue inhaler and regular monitoring. The specialist's office gave us a handful of medication samples to get started, but said we'd need to fill proper prescriptions within the month. Each medication cost more than I'd been making in a week at Patterson's. I finally got a call back from a grocery store that needed baggers and stockers. The pay was minimum wage, and I'd be working irregular hours based on their needs. I took the job because having something was better than having nothing. My first paycheck from the grocery store was about half of what I'd been making at Patterson's for the same number of hours worked. My dad got hired at the factory job, which helped with some bills, but not nearly enough to cover everything that had piled up. The hospital bills kept coming in the mail with payment due dates that we couldn't meet. My mom picked up every extra shift available, but her job had caps on overtime. We started getting warning notices about late utility payments. One night, I was in my room doing homework when my mom knocked on my door. She came in and sat on my bed and said we needed to talk about something. She looked tired and sad and older than she should have. She said she'd been thinking about what happened at Patterson's and that maybe there was something we could do about it. I asked what she meant, and she explained that she'd been talking to some people at her work who dealt with similar situations. One of her coworkers had a son who'd gotten fired from a different warehouse for leaving mid-shift when his father had a heart attack. That family had filed a complaint with some state agency about the policy being inhumane. My mom said she didn't know if anything had come of it, but that maybe it was worth trying. I said I didn't want to waste time on something that probably wouldn't work. She said she understood, but that it felt wrong to just let it go when what they'd done had been so clearly unfair. She asked if I could at least write down what happened in case we decided to pursue it later. I agreed mainly because I didn't want to argue with her when she already looked so defeated. Writing everything down took longer than I expected. I had to remember specific times and quotes and details about policies and what different people had said. Some parts were clear in my memory, but other parts had gotten fuzzy. I tried to stick to just facts without adding my opinions about how unfair it all felt. By the time I finished, it was 3 pages long, typed in a document on my laptop. My mom sent the document to her union rep, who who forwarded it to someone she knew at a workers' rights organization. A woman named Sandra from that organization called me a week later and asked if I'd be willing to talk about what happened. I said sure, and she asked detailed questions about the phone policy, the delayed message, the conversation with Derek and the HR woman, and the withholding of my final paycheck. Sandra said that some parts of what Patterson's had done were probably legal, but that other parts seemed questionable. The 3-hour delay in relaying an emergency message felt negligent, even if it technically followed their written policy. The withholding of wages for job abandonment might violate state labor laws, depending on how their employee handbook was written. She said she couldn't promise anything, but that she wanted to look into it further. I asked what looking into it further meant, and she explained that her organization sometimes helped workers file complaints with state agencies or negotiate with employers to change harmful policies. She said in some cases they could also help recover unpaid wages through legal channels. I asked if that would cost money, and she said their services were free, but that the process took time. Time felt like something we didn't have much of, given that the medical bills kept piling up and my grocery store job barely covered gas money. But Sandra said even if it didn't help me directly, creating a record of Patterson's practices might help other workers in the future. She asked if I'd be willing to let her use my story as part of a larger report about warehouse working conditions. I said yes, because making some kind of meaning out of this mess seemed better than just accepting it as the way things were. Over the next few weeks, Sandra called me several times to clarify details and ask follow-up questions. She sent me forms to sign authorizing her organization to act on my behalf with the State Labor Board. She explained that she was also reaching out to other former Patterson's employees who might have similar stories. I asked how many other people had been in situations like mine, and she said more than I'd probably want to know about. Meanwhile, my life continued in its new worse version. I worked at the grocery store whenever they scheduled me and tried to keep my grades up and helped Emma with her medications and watched my parents stress about bills. Peter got in trouble at school for getting into a fight with someone who'd been making fun of his glasses again. My mom had to take time off work to meet with his principal, which meant losing more hours we couldn't afford to lose. Emma had another asthma attack in late January that wasn't quite bad enough for the emergency room, but was still scary. My mom stayed home from work to monitor her, and I called out from the grocery store to help. My boss there was annoyed that I'd called out with only a few hours' notice, but said fine since I rarely missed shifts. I spent the day sitting with Emma while she used her nebulizer and tried to distract her with movies and card games. The hospital billing department started calling our house every few days, asking about the overdue payment. My mom explained our situation each time, and they'd say they understood, but that we still needed to set up a payment plan. She'd explain that we couldn't afford their minimum payment, and they'd say they understood, but that the account would be sent to collections if we didn't make arrangements. The conversations went in circles without solving anything. In February, Sandra called to say she'd filed a formal complaint with the State Labor Board on my behalf regarding Patterson's withholding of my final paycheck. She said the process would take several months at minimum, but that she was optimistic about recovering the wages they owed me. I asked what happened after that, and she said it depended on how Patterson's responded to the complaint. She also said she'd been compiling stories from other workers and found a pattern of Patterson's using the phone policy to avoid dealing with employee emergencies. One woman had been fired for taking a call from her son's school about a playground injury. Another had been terminated for checking her phone when her elderly mother's care facility called about a medication issue. The pattern suggested that the policy wasn't really about productivity, but about maintaining complete control over employees during their shifts. Sandra asked if I'd be willing to speak to a reporter who was doing a story about warehouse working conditions. I said I didn't know, and she said to think about it and let her know. The idea of making this whole thing public made my stomach hurt. I didn't want to be the face of some problem that was bigger than me. But I also thought about that woman whose son got injured and the other person whose mother had the medication issue. If Patterson's was doing this to lots of people, then maybe saying something publicly would matter. I talked to my parents about the reporter, and my mom said it was my decision, but that she'd support whatever I chose. My dad said to be careful because sometimes going public could backfire and make it harder to find work in the future. Peter said I should definitely do it because Patterson's sucked and deserved to get called out. Emma didn't really understand what we were talking about, but said she thought I should do whatever made me feel better. I called Sandra back and said I'd talk to the reporter, but that I didn't want my name used in the story. She said that was fine, and that most workers in these situations preferred to remain anonymous. A few days later, I spent an hour on the phone with a reporter named James who asked detailed questions about everything that happened. He said he was working on a longer piece about warehouse policies and worker rights that would run sometime in March. The article came out on a Sunday morning in mid-March. James had sent me a preview copy the night before, so I wasn't surprised by what it said, but seeing it in actual print still felt weird. The headline was something about warehouse workers forced to choose between family emergencies and employment. My story was included along with testimonies from other workers at different warehouses and distribution centers across the state. The article quoted labor law experts who said that while many of these policies were technically legal, they represented a broader problem with how low-wage workers were treated. One professor said that creating rigid rules that prevented employees from responding to emergencies was a way of controlling workers who had limited other options. The article also mentioned Patterson specifically and noted that the company had declined to comment for the story. I didn't know if anyone I knew would see the article, since it was in a somewhat regional paper that not everyone read. But by Monday afternoon, my phone was buzzing with texts from people at school who'd seen it shared online. Most people were supportive and said what happened to me was unfair. A few people asked why I'd gone public with it and suggested I was just looking for attention or trying to make excuses for getting fired. My supervisor at the grocery store pulled me aside during my shift and asked if the article was about me. I confirmed that it was, and he looked uncomfortable. He said he understood my situation, but that he hoped I wouldn't have similar issues at their store. I said I hadn't had any issues there, and he seemed relieved. The conversation felt like a warning, even though he'd framed it nicely. Sandra called that evening and said the article had generated more attention than she'd expected. Several other workers had reached out sharing similar experiences at Patterson's and other companies. She said there was momentum building to look at warehouse policies more broadly. I asked what that meant practically, and she said she wasn't sure yet, but that sometimes public attention created pressure for companies to change practices. The state labor board sent a letter in early April saying they were reviewing my complaint and that Patterson's had 30 days to respond. The letter included a lot of official language about investigation procedures and worker rights. I filed it away with all the other paperwork that had accumulated over the past few months. My final paycheck situation became more complicated when Patterson's responded to the labor board claiming that I had voluntarily abandoned my position and that per their clearly stated policy, no final wages were owed. They submitted a copy of the policy sheet I'd signed during training with my signature at the bottom. The labor board said they were reviewing both sides and would make a determination within 60 days. Emma's medical situation stabilized somewhat with her new medications, though we were still struggling to pay for everything. The hospital bills had been sent to collections, which meant phone calls at all hours from people demanding payment we didn't have. My mom had worked out a minimal payment plan, but we were barely keeping up with it. I found out in May that I'd qualified for a small scholarship for college based on my grades and my volunteer work from before everything fell apart. The scholarship wasn't nearly enough to cover full tuition, but it was something. I hadn't told anyone I'd even applied because I'd assumed I couldn't go anyway. Now I had this partial scholarship and no real way to use it, since I'd need to work full-time just to help my family stay afloat. The labor board made their determination in late May. They found that Patterson's policy about job abandonment was legal, but that their practice of withholding final wages for employees who left mid-shift was not. They ordered Patterson's to pay me for the hours I'd worked up until I left the building that night. The amount came to $347 minus taxes. Patterson's appealed the determination, which meant more waiting and more paperwork. Sandra said appeals could take months to process, and that there was no guarantee they wouldn't find some other reason to avoid paying. I felt tired thinking about fighting over $347 when the medical bills alone were thousands. School ended and summer started, and I picked up more hours at the grocery store. My dad's factory job was going okay, but the pay was still less than what he'd made before. My mom was burning out from all the extra shifts. Peter finished 8th grade, and Emma finished 5th. We were surviving, but it didn't feel like much more than that. Sandra called in June to say that a state legislator had gotten interested in the warehouse worker stories and was considering proposing new regulations about emergency communication policies. She said it was a long shot, but that sometimes one publicized case could lead to broader changes. I said that was good, but I couldn't help feeling skeptical that anything would actually change. The appeal process dragged on through July and August. Patterson's kept submitting paperwork arguing that their policy was clearly stated and that I'd accepted the terms when I signed the employment agreement. The labor board kept responding that policy about shift abandonment didn't override requirements to pay for hours actually worked. Back and forth in official language that meant nothing was happening. I turned 17 in August and spent the day working at the grocery store. My family had cake that evening, and my mom cried a little because things weren't how she'd wanted them to be for my birthday. I told her it was fine and that birthdays didn't really matter. Emma gave me a drawing she'd made of our family, and I put it up on my wall even though looking at it made me sad about how much harder everything had gotten. The final decision on the Pattersons' appeal came in September, which was almost 9 months after I'd left that job. The labor board upheld their original determination that Pattersons owed me the wages for hours worked. They added some penalty fees for the delay, and the total came to around $400. Pattersons had 30 days to pay or face additional penalties. $400 wasn't going to solve any of our problems, but it felt important anyway. It meant someone official had looked at what happened and determined that Pattersons had been wrong. That mattered even though it didn't change anything about the choice I'd had to make or the consequences I'd faced for making it. The check from Pattersons arrived in October along with no apology or explanation, just a payroll check with the official amount. I deposited it and gave half to my parents for bills and kept the rest for college application fees because my guidance counselor had convinced me to at least try applying even if I probably couldn't afford to go. Sandra called that same month to say the state legislator had introduced a bill requiring certain employers to allow workers to respond to verified family emergencies without penalty. The bill was narrow and had lots of exceptions and probably wouldn't pass, but it was something. She said my story had been part of what motivated the legislator to look into the issue. I thanked her for all her help over the past year, and she said she wished she could have done more. She said cases like mine reminded her why the work mattered, even when the outcomes weren't perfect. After we hung up, I sat in my room looking at college brochures and medical bills and pay stubs from the grocery store and tried to figure out what came next. Emma was doing better with her new medications, though we were still figuring out payment plans for the specialist appointments. Peter had made some new friends and seemed less miserable about school. My dad had gotten a small raise at the factory. My mom had cut back her hours slightly because her body couldn't sustain the pace she'd been working. We were adjusting to a new normal that wasn't good, but also wasn't the worst thing possible. I'm applying to colleges now mostly because my guidance counselor won't leave me alone about it. I'm writing essays about overcoming challenges and learning resilience, and other things admission offices want to hear. I don't mention that I'm probably not going to be able to afford to attend even if I get accepted. That part seems too depressing to put in an essay. The grocery store promoted me to shift lead, which comes with an extra $1 per hour. It's not much, but it's something. I still think about that night at Patterson's sometimes and wonder if there was anything I could have done differently. But I know the answer is no, because the whole situation was designed to have no good options. The warehouse probably still has the same phone policy. Other workers are probably facing the same impossible choices. Sandra's organization is still trying to help people, and that state bill is still sitting in some committee going nowhere. The hospital bills are getting paid down slowly over time. Emma is breathing better. Peter got new glasses again. My dad goes to work every day, and my mom does too, and I do too. Sometimes I see job listings for warehouse positions that pay better than the grocery store. I don't apply to them. I know what kinds of policies places like that have, and I know I can't work somewhere that might make me choose between helping my family and keeping my job. Maybe that limits my options, but at least I know where my line is now. The choice I made that night wasn't really a choice at all when you think about it. There was only one thing I could have done that I could live with afterward. Everything else was just consequences I had to accept. People keep telling me I did the right thing, but doing the right thing doesn't feel as good as everyone suggests it should. Mostly it just feels complicated and expensive and unresolved.